and welcome everyone. We're really glad to have you here today for the next in our series, Day One and Beyond, which is taking you through a series of topics and activities related to building out on Oracle Cloud. For those of you who might be new to these events, we're hosted on Cloud Customer Connect, which is our Oracle community forum for end users. I'll drop some links in the chat, share some resources that will lead you back to those forums. And if you're not already a member, we invite you to create a free account, join in discussions, post any questions, and look for upcoming events on all kinds of topics. My name is Kenna Kettrick. I'm a program manager with the OCI go-to-market team, and I'm joined by Kumar and Brandon Alarie, both cloud engineers here at Oracle. And today we have a special guest, Johannes Murmann, Master Principal Cloud Architect, for a focus on security quick start at OCI. All right, I think that is enough. I'm going to go hand it over to Brandon and Uma. Go ahead, take it away.
Thanks, Kenna. So hi, everyone. My name is Brandon Alarie. I'm a cloud engineer here on the customer enablement team. And today we're going to be talking about security in Oracle Cloud. So with me today, I'm joined with Kumar, who is also a cloud engineer. And we also have Johannes Murmann, who is a Master Principal Cloud Architect. Do either of you want to introduce yourselves now?
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. So hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm really excited to be talking with you guys again, this time on security and, being joined by our very special guest, Johannes.
Thanks. Hi, guys. This is Johannes. I'll be I'm working with the security services on a daily basis with customers. So hopefully today we can share some best practices and things we've learned along the way. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just want to double check. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so for the agenda today, first we're going to be taking a look at Oracle's security principles. Then we'll be looking at the different security services available to us in OCI. We'll take a brief look at identity and access management, followed by some of our data protection services. All right. And this slide here, you may have seen before if you joined some of our other webinars, but these are some of our main major services that are available to us within Oracle Cloud. And today we're going to be focusing on security. It's this section over here on the right underneath governance and administration. We're going to be talking about CloudGuard, Vault, and some of the other services listed here. But as you know, security plays a key role within Oracle Cloud. And a lot of different services security services are integrated within most of our core infrastructure pieces. When it comes to networking, we have our virtual firewalls, like our security lists and our network security groups. And so there's many different security services that span across all of the different offerings we have.
Yeah, so kind of, speaking of that, one of our pillars we've talked about is integrated. So having kind of a unified platform of security. So, this slide kind of goes through the different pillars talking about Oracle security. So Johannes, can you take us through maybe like a couple of them? Ease of use is huge, as well as being prescriptive, and kind of give your insight onto Oracle security overall and the principles that we follow.
Sure. So obviously simple. I mean, over the years we've learned that folks don't get breached. Well, they get breached because sometimes it's just too complex, right? To make sure everything is set up correctly. So we want to make it easy to have that baseline security baseline in place. So really within OCI, things like CloudGuard is a single click. Vulnerability scanning is a single click. Things like that. To simply have those enabled and watch your tenancy. We also put in, the knowledge over the years and what we've learned, and also looking at other kind of CAS benchmarks to be prescriptive in some of our CloudGuard detectors, right? We know what to look for, as a baseline. So we do that. Mm-hmm. And we try to make sure that these different things are integrated. It can be across OCI. So vulnerability scanning will send all its results to CloudGuard. So you go one place to look in CloudGuard for your security problems instead of having to go multiple places. And also OCI IAM and the SSO experience single sign-on across, whether it's OCI or SaaS services, it's all using the same tools and components here, right? So there's just one way of doing things. And just kind of at the bottom one here, right? Obviously CloudGuard and vulnerability scanning, OS management, patch management, all that stuff. That's just part of our core platform, right? It's not like a service you need to buy.
Yeah, definitely. And so kind of moving on to the next slide as well, talking about how we have security kind of from core to edge is kind of one of our sayings. So this is just kind of a brief description of all the different security services we have at different points kind of in your cloud stack. So through identity, which is something that we'll go through, our identity and access management, we also touched on in the technical cloud quick start, as well as Brandon mentioned earlier in terms of networking. We have several different components of security, including, your from security lists and network security groups to your virtual cloud networks as well. And then all the way to kind of monitoring and internet and edge. So using our WAF protection as well as DDoS protection.
Yep. Thank you, Uma. So moving on to identity and access management. This is our first point. So, you can use this to for authentication, inbound SSO and outbound SSO. We also have multi-factor authentication. If you wanted, that more secure login, you could use multi-factor authentication. We also support, MFA with like a third-party authenticator app if you wanted to use Google Authenticator, or like a one-time message. We also have like Microsoft Active Directory Bridge and some tools to help us set that up within identity and access management. And then Johannes, would you want to, maybe talk about some of these other features of this tool?
Yeah, sure. And just taking a step back as well, this picture, we also obviously want to represent, identity as a service, right? This is a kind of, service that can be used whether you log into the OCI tenancy or, you use it to protect your other kind of enterprise apps and do kind of, enterprise IAM is like a bigger service where we want to cater to those use cases, right? And that's just, as you mentioned, Active Directory Bridge, for example, that's for delegated authentication. You got your users with credentials in Active Directory. You don't want to move those users and passwords, which can be trickier, right? To our OCI IAM. So we've got Active Directory Bridge, which actually can interface to your AD and can, you can still leave your users there. A few things to call out on the right-hand side is that obviously, once a user has been authenticated, always that happens on the left-hand side, right? We know who the user is, and now that user needs to get access to certain other kind of applications or resources. And there are some typical scenarios like federated SSO. Obviously you can work with different like SaaS apps that have service providers. You can that's good old-fashioned, SAML. That's obviously a given that's used a lot today. We also have Radius proxy that can be used to actually authenticate to Oracle databases or VPN clients. We got a PAM module that you can use on your Oracle Linux boxes if you wanted to, when folks log in with a username and password on those boxes, they can actually be authenticated against OCI IAM. And the bottom one is kind of catering to use cases where we have enterprise apps, could be homegrown, could be some older ones that do not support, for example, OAuth or federation. We have a gateway ready to go that, as kind of a software appliance that you can deploy and put in front of your enterprise apps. And it will go do the HTTP header kind of approach, sending information down to that app and protecting it, right? So we can still get it under the same umbrella as the rest, even though it might not support more modern ways of integrating. So yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. And we also have the app catalog. So if you want to think about this, from like a higher level, you can use this tool to manage identities across many different enterprise applications. So we do have that application catalog to help you, set up and configure those identities. There's also a question in the chat, Johannes. I'm not sure if you want to answer that now or hold off, but someone was asking about the difference between OCI IAM and IDCS.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it used to be the case that we would look at those two different as two different services. And going forward, it's going to be one. So depending on your tenancy and how old it is, if you've had it for many years, then you might still see, IDCS as a separate kind of an OCI IAM as two separate things. If you get a new tenancy today, we've actually integrated all of that, and there is a migration effort to obviously get customers that up to the one where it's all converged. Obviously, to address some of the shortfalls of having two IAM systems. So when we say OCI IAM, that is a convergence of IDCS and OCI IAM, that you have within your OCI tenancy.
Mm-hmm. And one other question as well, I think that was put in chat was, is OCI IAM still separate from the IDCS Foundation Suite that comes for free when getting into infrastructure as a service? So I think that can also be, talked about right now. That is something that I think is changing in certain newer tenancy with the IAM domains. Is that correct, Johannes?
Well, that's a good question. I think some of these, especially around, license terms and all that, I must admit I'm not 100% qualified for that. So probably we should follow up on things like that. What exactly is included, what's not included.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Awesome. All right. So next we can move on here to our infrastructure vault service. All right. So this is a logical container for your different keys. And then a key would be a logical container for key versions. And then the key version is actually the key material that you have stored within the vault. So this is a service where you can manage different keys for your different databases. You can manage different secrets and have that all in one place. You could also have these keys on a protected hardware security module for more security. And if you wanted to meet some regulatory compliances that you may have in place.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of being able to store your keys and being able to use different algorithms to help you encrypt your data, as well as storing secrets as well, which are going to be your credentials, like your passwords and your authentication tokens that will help you access your OCI resources. Right.
Yep.
Anything you want to add to this slide, Johannes?
No, I think you covered it. Just taking a step back, it's all about how much control do I want over the keys being used in the different services. That's pretty much it, right? And secondly, around secrets, it's not used that much, but I think it's worth calling out that, especially when you move towards a more infrastructure as code approach, and using different kind of scripts to provision our resources. Obviously, we do not want any kind of passwords or things of that nature in the scripts. So that's where we often recommend actually, and Terraform does that, right? You call out and use the vault to as well as store different kind of secrets, i.e. passwords that are necessary to connect to other services. So really trying to eliminate that need of any kind of hard-coded sensitive data in scripts. That's what I had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. So next we'll be looking at CloudGuard. So CloudGuard is a service that helps customers achieve and sustain a strong security posture. This is going to identify problems and then provide you with recommendations or remediations to fix those problems. And you can easily integrate CloudGuard with other tools within OCI. And then some of those tools are going to be, integrated out of the box as soon as you turn it on. And this is also a free service. So it's really good, service to take advantage of.
Yeah, and I believe now Johannes will kind of take us through some of the important Cloud Guard concepts and kind of how it works.
Yeah, sure. So looking at Cloud Guard, right? The idea is to, get a good understanding of your security posture of your complete tenancy, right? Using Cloud Guard. So what that means is Cloud Guard will scan your tenancy for configuration and activity related things, right? And report on that. So obviously, it'll pick up if there's something that's not correct in there. The way we do that is we have what is called targets, which is essentially, think about your compartment hierarchy. You kind of set a target that's within your compartment hierarchy. It could be at the root or further down. And then in that target, you also associate what we call detectors, right? That's like the mechanism that goes out and uses rules to find potential problems. So you can have multiple targets. You can have a root one. We always recommend a root one. And then you have additional targets below in that compartment hierarchy, and they could be more specific. So that way you always have full coverage, but you can have more specific definitions of targets. For example, you could have prod, non-prod, different targets, with some different conditions in there. Detectors, we have 3 types of detectors: activity related, configuration related, and one that's called threat related. And that's actually, there's one rule in there called rogue user. So that's under user, where the other is on resources. The other 2 are related to config and activity on OCI resources. Threat is on user activity. The detectors will find different kind of, they have findings, right, that turn into problems, which then have a severity attached to them. And Cloud Guard will raise those problems and alert you on that. And then we have responders that allow certain actions to be taken on certain problems. So at the minimum, we have a a notification responder that can simply just create an event, and further processing can happen based on that event. We can, whether sending an email, creating a ticket, whatever. That's like the basic functionality of that responder is create an event. And then we have some dedicated responders that can go and do an action. The public is the private, the bucket is public. We want to turn to private. The responder can do that automatically. So those responders we typically use, we take care before enabling those to not disrupt, production workloads. So good to go to the next slide. So talking about these Cloud Guard problems, just want to touch on a little bit on the life cycle here, how this works. Because when a detector runs and, the rules within the detector pick up basically a signal, that's a finding, right? That finding will be turned into a problem, a new problem if it didn't exist, and it will be in an open state. Now there are 2 choices with these kind of problems. They can either be, they can remain open, which we don't want, and obviously we'll see that in the reports that there's an open problem that's been there for ages. That's not a good thing. So either it can be resolved or it can be dismissed. Resolving it can happen in 2 ways. We can go and say, I clicked the resolve button because, hey, I took care of it. I did actually myself change that bucket's visibility to private, or I closed a port somewhere, and we're good to go. Now, Cloud Guard doesn't really trust us on that. So it'll obviously still go and check all of that. And if it's true, if it doesn't find a problem anymore, cool, it'll stay resolved. If it actually finds that, I wasn't really being completely honest or I forgot about it, it will reopen that problem from a resolved state back to open. So it comes at the top of our list again. If Cloud Guard, if somebody actually goes and changes the public, the visibility of the bucket to private, outside of this, Cloud Guard will just detect it at some point and itself mark that problem as resolved. So that's the usual kind of flow. Where we really don't want to go too much is dismissed. That's where we look at a problem and say, yeah, okay, I'm cool with this. I'll just dismiss it. It's an exception, maybe I'll dismiss it, or there's some reason for that. But really, we want to keep the minimum, the number of problems that we dismiss to a minimum. Because if if that number is kind of high, then there's either a problem with our baseline, we're generating too much noise, or we need to figure out how to fix these problems. So go ahead. Next slide. So a really simple scenario here to kind of just visualize some of the things I mentioned. Imagine on the left-hand side, you create a bucket and you just go ahead and say, yeah, sure, I want to have it public. So essentially, folks on the internet, if they, manage to, they could find it. CloudGuard will run through your tenancy in the background. It'll find the configuration detector has a rule that says, is your bucket public? Your visibility is public. It will trigger, there'll be a finding, it'll trigger a problem saying this bucket is public, so severity is critical on that one. And from that point on, it's created a problem. And depending on our setup, two things can happen. First of all, cloud event is the typical notification responder that we always recommend is enabled. It'll kick off an event, and OCI events, will generate that event, and more processing can happen, more integration can happen. It can be simple emails, it could be Slack, it could be something integrated into your ticketing system, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that can happen is there's an actual responder, a bucket responder enabled as well, that gets ready to change the visibility of the bucket. But the default setup is that it waits for an operator, CloudGuard operator, to actually go and acknowledge that it's okay to do. And when we click OK, the responder changes the visibility back to private, and we are in the green again. So that's a typical kind of scenario here, where I would say 100% of the time we use the cloud event responder. I'm very rarely seen it's not used, and sometimes we use additional responders if it makes sense, right? Because if we find a compute instance with a public IP address, we do have a responder that says, well, you can stop the instance. That might not be the best course of action depending on the actual use case. So go ahead.
Exactly.
So on the detectors, one thing to note here is as going back to one of the initial slides about being prescriptive. So Oracle has created what we call Oracle managed recipes. So these detectors have recipes, which basically is a grouping of rules, right? So we have these 3 managed recipes, one for configuration, one for activity, one for threat. What we suggest is that, well, we've thought about what should be enabled, what should be the criticality, high, medium, critical of these different rules. But we know from your perspective, you have certain security policies, you have a way of looking at things. So those very often get changed as part of a CloudGuard tuning process. We enable CloudGuard, and after a while we pick up some problems and we start tuning and figuring out how to reduce noise. So what we say here is the best practice is to clone those managed recipes, at least make one clone of each, and then go and adapt them. Some of these we might want to disable some of these rules for some targets, like your sandbox or whatever. Some we want to change the criticality. So that's always a best practice to clone your recipes and work off of those recipes. When we add new things to the managed recipes, they will be available in the clone recipes. It's not like you'll be missing out on additional new rules being added. But it's really that's really my recommendation here, working with a set of clone recipes, and often we'll have multiple recipes being used for multiple different targets. Go ahead, Brandon.
So it's better to clone the Oracle managed recipe than try to go in and create your own from scratch.
Yes, it gives you more flexibility. So I think we all talked about the responders. Not much to say here. Then always make sure to. Well, one thing is you can go and look at the dashboard of CloudGuard, but we also know that the system just needs to somehow alert you, and the notification responder is a great way to get that initial integration going, whether it's just email initially or maybe hooking up to some ticketing system. So that's definitely what we recommend to begin with, and then potentially using some additional remediation responders if it makes sense in that specific use case. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for, talking about CloudGuard. I think we're gonna revisit that in a little bit after a few more slides and come back to a demo. But there's a few other services we wanted to cover before that. So Uma, do you want to take us through OCI vulnerability scanning?
Yeah, so I'll let actually Johannes kind of take these ones because we have a few that are pretty similar. So for the vulnerability scanning service, we're basically looking at your different virtual machines and bare metal hosts and container images and scanning and looking at the different potential risks. And it also, you can see from this graphic, it sends to CloudGuard as well. So Johannes, can you talk a little bit about kind of how that works together, those two services?
Yeah, so vulnerability scanning service, yeah, as you said, it's something that runs on your host, your VMs, and it looks at for two things, right? It looks to, well, it does three things actually, to be precise. It does a port scan, looking at open ports. It does a host scan, looking at different packages and OS setup, and highlighting what CVEs, vulnerabilities it finds that would need action. And then it also runs a CIS benchmark against those hosts and kind of calling out where does that host deviate from the CIS benchmark. Now, those findings, you can just go to the vulnerability scanning service kind of dashboard and look at all these things and by itself. But what makes sense here is that within CloudGuard, VSS actually creates either a scanned host has port problems, or has some host scan problems, and then it'll detail, obviously, and I'll show that later on. But it'll detail what the problem is, whether which kind of ports are open, or which host scan kind of CVEs it found, right? So it makes sense to have that in one place, because CloudGuard can then be used to report on, or CloudGuard can be the one creating events, sending events and data to a SIM, for example, for further processing.
And then go ahead, Johannes.
Yeah, so the certificate services is a little bit more recent addition as well, where we want to make it simple to handle certificates within OCI. So this is a little bit like your certificate authority, where you can, and especially this integration was calling out here that the load balance, obviously, if you're using a load balancer for your workload, and for HTTP traffic, HTTPS traffic, you can have a certificate related to a load balancer. You can use the certificate service to manage that certificate and rotate it. And also CloudGuard will keep an eye on, when that certificate otherwise would run out, right? Expire, kind of let you know about that. So we won't have some of these typical, at least in the past, suddenly a website had a problem because the certificate was expired, right? So we have that integration going as well here for certificate service, load balance, and CloudGuard. And then, jumping to the right, Bastion service. We wanted to have a service that was easy to use for your ad hoc need when you need to access either of these resources underneath, but really, you have a lockdown tendency. So just getting access, for example, to compute can be difficult. So the idea was we had a Bastion service that would remove the need for maintaining your own jump box, but at an ad hoc basis, you can just basically have a Bastion. It's a managed service, and you simply click a button, and it will help you create those connections directly to your compute, acting as a jump server, but we manage it. So it's really meant for these ad hoc situations where you need access to a compute on a private network, and you don't want to kind of, having to spin up your own jump box and all that stuff. You can use the Bastion. And it is time-based sessions with a 3-hour window. So it's not like it's going to be, more and more sessions, will be available and open, right? So those will be closed down, and for security reasons, kind of minimizing the potential attack surface here. And yeah, it's an easy way to get access to these different resources shown here, if you have them on private networks, for example. Go ahead.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. The WAF, our web application firewall, one of the services we want to call out, a layer 7 service that provides the usual kind of firewall, inspection of packages and all that stuff, having policies in place, blocking traffic, looking at whether it's a bot, whether it's a human, employing capture functionality to make sure of that, and really it's tightly integrated with our load balancer, so you can easily have that load balancer sitting in your and being protected by WAF policies, and also CloudGuard will alert on that. So that's one of the services. If you have external facing, for example, traffic, north-south traffic, you can have WAF sitting at the edge, a managed firewall that will protect that traffic or inspect the traffic. But you can also use it within your tenancy east-west, right? Between different services, we can also have the WAF and load balancer sitting, looking at traffic. So really, we can have a good all-around protection and inspection of traffic going between different points in your tenancy. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Johannes, for sharing that kind of on those, the overview of those different security services in OCI, and we'll go through some data protection before we hop into the console, and Johannes gives us kind of a demo going through CloudGuard and maybe the vulnerability scanning. But I just wanted to briefly touch on what Data Safe is. So this is one of our fully integrated cloud services, and it's focused on protecting your sensitive and regulated data in your Oracle Cloud databases. So you can use this in your OCI databases, Oracle databases, as well as on-premise. And it's pretty simple in the console of how to set it up. You would simply register your target database, and then you could click into the Data Safe console where you can run a few different features that we have. So we have kind of 5 different assessments: our security assessment, our user assessment, data discovery, data masking, and activity auditing. So you can kind of see some of the on the slide, some of the different things. So assessing your security configuration, detecting any configuration drift, identifying risky users, monitoring your database activity, and being able to discover your sensitive data and then be able to mask it. So those are all kind of different things that you'd be able to run using Data Safe.
Yeah, and it's that single pane of glass view to kind of monitor all these aspects from different databases. So you can connect multiple different databases to this tool and then go through, running those security checks that Uma mentioned.
Yeah. And then going on to our slide on data protection. So this is kind of just an overview of the different levels, I guess, of data protection that we provide on OCI. So we have kind of a few different types of data storage, right? Resources. So like block volume, file storage, object storage, and then your database. So, you can see your block and your file storage. Your data is encrypted at rest and in transit. And you'll also have the option to secure data using the Vault service and being able to bring your own keys to encrypt. And then for object storage, it's encrypted at rest, and you're also able to bring your own keys. And there's also an option to create, private and public buckets as well. And you also have the option to create your pre-authenticated requests or PARs for different buckets, which is essentially a URL that has a certain expiration date, which will allow users to access the bucket without having to use, their own credentials to do so. And then lastly, for the Oracle database, we'll have our transparent data encryption, or TDE, to encrypt the data at rest. And then there's also the options that we went through, such as Data Safe and Data Vault, which will help you secure your data. So that's just kind of at a glance the different services. And then Johannes, can you talk a little bit about this slide? This kind of has to do more with our observability and management, but how does that fit in with kind of security as a whole on OCI?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, the tenancy, one way or another, will generate a lot of different data, right? Whether it's CloudGuard, audit logs, custom logs, metrics. And very often we see that we need to get that data from the tenancy in some kind of unified format and out to different other systems, very often SIM tools, for example, for threat hunting teams to look at, right? And that's where in the OCI tenancy, we've looked at how we can do that and what kind of services we have at our disposal, right? So really we have resources on the left-hand side, which are any kind of OCI resources. It could be a load balancer, it could be a flow log, could be your audit log. And you can have your custom apps that also produce logs that we can also ingest, and they can also produce custom metrics using the OCI metrics service, right? And all of that data, whether it's audit, events, logging, or monitoring, some of this can live in OCI logging, some live in the event service, but we can use the service connector hub as the glue to pull out specific data, or for example, all your audit data across all of your tenancy, and make it available to, on the right-hand side, different other services, function as a service, calling some kind of serverless function, notifications, that could be sending stuff to PagerDuty or Slack or just an email. Streaming, very often you use Kafka compatible stream to send data to a stream to be picked up by different SIMs, like, what have you, like your Splunk would just read from a stream. And then we have the object storage as a way to also put data either for safekeeping, if you have certain requirements, right, where data should be retained for X number of years, for example, or simply if you have other kind of applications that are not capable of doing streaming, they could simply use the object storage because it's also S3 compatible. So there are a lot of existing tools that will just be able to read from that. But this is basically our way of making sure that the data and the audit, the logs, whatever the tenancy produces, it needs to be able to get out of the tenancy very often. And that's what we're trying to do with this, and using the Service Connector Hub and some of these other services on the right-hand side. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then this last slide here before we jump into the console for a demo. This has some of the different compliance certifications that we have at OCI. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the ones that we have. Within the console, there's a section where you can navigate to view a more exhaustive list of all of our complete compliance certifications if there's one that you're looking for in particular. And I think we can just show you briefly where that is too when we're in the console. So with that, I think we can hand it over to Johannes, who will share the Oracle Cloud Console.
Sure, will do. So now everybody should be able to see my browser with the startup kind of page for the OCI console. If not, shout out. So if we look at, and always this is familiar to a lot of you folks probably, but we have our identity and security menu item where we'll be able to recognize, well, almost all of these things we talked about today. Seeing these different like identity part of it, obviously with the users and groups and all that stuff and policies. Then CloudGuard, that's the area I'll be looking at. We also touched on scanning, vulnerability scanning, so I'll just briefly go into that as well. One thing to call out, we didn't really touch so much on security zones, kind of a way of enforcing, CloudGuard, just to kind of put that in perspective. CloudGuard is reactive. It looks at your tenancy and says, you got a problem here, we need to address that. Security zones is proactive, where you can lock down, what you're allowed to do. So, a combination of these two is really interesting for some use cases to really lock down the tenancy. So in this demo, I'll not be going to security zones, but looking at CloudGuard. So the CloudGuard service is it's a global service. It looks at all your regions. It's not like you have to go and say, I added a new region. I was subscribing to, let me just add another region and I need to do something. No, CloudGuard looks at all of your globally, all your regions, but you need to decide on a reporting region, right? And the reason why we've done that is, for example, in Europe, there are different requirements as to where, data residency, right? So you decide on a reporting region, but no matter which region you're in, you can always access CloudGuard and work with it. It's just where your actual data will be stored. When we look at CloudGuard, and this has just been running for a day or two now, but CloudGuard continuously monitors your tenancy and continuously updates certain scores around your tenancy, applying some algorithms. But really what you'll see is security score. Think of that as very high level percentage, right? Basically saying the higher the percentage, the better. What that means is that in my case, 86% of the scanned resources did not have any problems. It's not so much about which kind of criticality. It's more like 86% of those did not have any problems. So that's kind of, means there's a smaller number of resources that have some kind of problems. The risk score is more looking at, the number of problems, the criticality, and the actual resources, right? And this goes from 0 to 9999, right? Has been normalized for just under 10,000, and the lower number is better. So this is more looking at, your kind of your risk surface or attack surface, right? That you can have a large number of minor problems that will not count as much versus, if you have critical or high problems, right, on certain resources. So this is just an overview page, giving you an idea about how things are, how kind of a trend and stuff like that. It'll take a little bit of time typically for CloudGuard to start producing, some of this data, because obviously it needs data before these different algorithms and data models can be applied. One thing to call out is CloudGuard will try to kind of give you some recommendations up here based on some of your problems, what to do with them, and then you can kind of go and look at these recommendations. Like, obviously if a bucket is public, you probably want to make it private, things like that. Responder status in this case is 0. It doesn't show any remediations or any pending. That's because my CloudGuard setup does not have any automatic responders enabled. Otherwise, you'll be able to see here that, you actually have 5 pending, responder actions that you need to acknowledge, because we've said that, somebody needs to acknowledge and okay that a certain action is taken. If we look at the main menu items over here, we have targets. Remember, target is kind of your association between, a compartment within your hierarchy, and it can be at the top root compartment, and detector and responder recipes, right? So that's where you kind of go and say, for my tenancy-wide target, which is always a best practice to have a tenancy-wide target, because it will capture anything in your tenancy, including IAM-related events that will not be captured also with a target that's sitting somewhere in a smaller kind of child compartment somewhere, because IAM lives at the root level. So this target here has, it looks at the root. So here's the compartment assignment. And then it has been associated with the 3 different types of detectors: activity, configuration, and threat. And you notice just from the naming, I just went ahead and kind of gave it this name to obviously show that I'm using a cloned version of the recipe. And here we have the same, there's only kind of one responder recipe. And each recipe of these, whether it's detector or responders, they will have multiple rules within them. And you can see obviously auto manage no. So this is a cloned one. So this is a typical way of setting up, from day 0, day 1 or day 0, when you start out, you want to have your target-wide, tenancy-wide target set up, right? To make sure CloudGuard touches anything and it looks at everything. And then you can add additional more specialized targets that sit further down your compartment hierarchy, where you can go and specialize. And specialize could be different things. It could be using different detectors. It could be that you're saying that in this one, I'm actually using, in this target for my workload 2, whatever that is, I'm using a different detector, right? So altogether, it's a different detector for configuration. So that's one way of, customizing or changing, how your targets and is looking at a certain area of your tenancy. You can also go and add additional conditions on your recipes, right? On your rules. So if we go and look at detectors first, we have these different detectors. Some are Oracle managed, some are the clones. So let's look at one of the cloned one. This one, for example. What you'll see here is you have your recipe. A recipe has a lot of rules in there. Those rules have different settings. Now I'm going in and looking at a rule at the recipe level. It's not associated to a target at the moment. This is the actual recipe, right? Think of this as kind of, your programming. This kind of a class is not an instance of a class, it's the actual class. So here I have the option to enable, disable this rule, change what should be the criticality, and also add additional labels that can be used, for when filtering and stuff like that. And I can add as well conditional groups here. For example, tags, whether I want to include or exclude resources with certain tags. So, but here is the area where we would go and tweak risk level, whether things should be enabled or not, at that level, at like the recipe level. If I go to the target and I now go and look at this detector that has been associated. So now we're kind of looking at an instance of a recipe if you want. I can go now and look at this under the target, look at the associated recipe. And what you will notice is I cannot change these settings up here because that happens at the recipe level, but I can still, for this specific association in this target, I can still change the conditions. So that's also a way to specialize, per target. You can use the same detectors, but you can apply different conditions. One thing to call out here is, in case you guys haven't seen it, that we have custom lists that if you need to put in certain conditions, like using certain OSIDs for certain instances, or IP address, site ranges, stuff like that, we can use lists for that. And we do actually have one list already created for the typical Oracle OCI services network kind of CIDR blocks that can be used in a white listing use case. So this was a little bit about the difference between your actual recipe, your target, and how it's associated. And, the target has association with a compartment and a recipe. At the end of the day, those detectors will be running and they'll generate problems. So a typical way this looks is like this, right? You go and I'm just looking at everything and it's just sorted by risk level. And we can see the critical ones up here are related to actually scanned host has vulnerabilities or scanned host has open ports. So this is actually vulnerability scanning service that has scanned my compute instances. It does that on a daily basis and it's found issues that it has sent this to CloudGuard and CloudGuard creates a problem. Other things like, bucket is public, all these things, a ton of different rules that are being triggered here that we need to go and look at and figure out, is there some tuning we need to do, or is this a general problem we need to address, right? Because some of these could be, the baseline setup of CloudGuard can be tuned to certain use cases or security requirements you guys have. And that's just a common thing to do, right? Enabling CloudGuard and after that going through a tuning phase. If we look at a problem, this is obviously coming from one of the scanning service. We can see what resource this is a compute instance has a problem. When was it first detected, last detected? So that also can give you an idea about, has this been nobody has really been taking any action on this one. If it's been lying around for some time, this is a brand new instance. So that's obviously the same data was detected and last detected. And then we have some additional data over here around the actual CVEs. Now, and that's fine. We can look at these numbers, or we can actually go then over to vulnerability scanning to further, see what's going on. But this is the integration we talked about between CloudGuard and vulnerability scanning. What you'll notice down here in problem history is kind of an audit log that it will, CloudGuard will update this. And also if I go and say, guys, I fixed all of this. I fixed the problem and now it's dismissed. So this is an audit trail. This does not go away, right? This will basically say, well, Johannes, marked this problem as dismissed. So this is also, if there's a need for, understanding what happened, whatever, we can go back and have that audit trail in here, right? Which is a nice thing to have. So it's not possible to really change anything on a problem unless it gets caught by CloudGuard itself in that kind of audit trail. So this is about the different kind of problems. Just want to be mindful of the time here that responders, just calling out, if you notice the cloud event one was the one I talked about. It's a type notification and it's enabled, and then all the other one in my case have been disabled, but you can actually go and enable those and they can be used to have CloudGuard remediate some of your problems if that fit with your use case. But in my case, it's only the cloud event. Two final things I want to touch on is cloud events. So what does that actually do? Well, cloud events creates an event within the event service. We set up rules that will trigger on those events. So just calling out, there's a very common pattern here that for SIM integration, that we set up rules and say any event matching coming from CloudGuard, either a new problem is detected, a problem was dismissed or remediated. Obviously you can kind of change how you want to do this, but for any of these three problems, very often we want to send data to a SIM. And the way we do that is using a function, kind of sending stuff to streams and all that stuff. We'll leave that for another day, but just want to calling out that we use events. And basically the way this is being triggered is CloudGuard creates an event that has a certain event type, and the event service picks up on that, and the integration continues from there. Finally, the vulnerability scanning service, which, again, it's a one-click thing, and you can enable in your compute instances, and they'll be scanned. Different ways of slicing, dicing the data, and it also uses the same concept of targets, similar to how CloudGuard works. So you want to put this typically at the root of your tenancy instead of just individual compartments, because you run the risk of losing coverage if you only do it by compartment, right? And somebody creates a compute instance outside of that compartment. But really, it goes and scans to different instances. This is just a kind of a snapshot of a host I created, where it goes and says, well, what's the risk level, what's the issues found? And then you can kind of go and look at this and see, oh, what were the problems? What were the vulnerabilities? How are we doing in terms of CS benchmark, and address that. You can head on over to the compute instance, and actually, because we also have integrated this with OS management service as the other service we mentioned, you can actually go and address some of the security issues that have been found by doing security patching. So I'll stop here. I know we only have 4 minutes left, so that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for the in-depth demo of CloudGuard. I think that was really helpful. So I think we have just a few seconds left or minutes left. Was there another poll, Kenna, that you wanted to run before we wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. I'll go ahead and pop this up. This is just our usual conclusion poll. So we're curious from our audience just to get a little feedback about the session. And then if you haven't already, you can go ahead and pop any questions that you have into that Q&A box. And we have a couple minutes left for final wrap up and sharing resources and Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind giving us your answers there, and I'll hand it back to Uma and Brandon and Johannes for a final wrap up and Q&A.
I'll stop sharing so you can go back to PowerPoint.
Thank you. All right. So finally here we have some helpful links. So the first ones are for Oracle University. We have our training and certification pass. The next one, we have our hands-on labs. So if you're looking for more of those, self-paced learning where you can go into an environment and deploy some resources, we have our link for our hands-on labs. The next one is one of our hands-on labs. It's just a good one to start with. So covers a lot of our different core services. That's the, OCI Core Lab. We also have autonomous database labs. And then we have our learning library on YouTube as well. So thank you for all your time today. With that, I can hand it back over to Kenna.
All right, looks like there were some questions in the Q&A still open. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at those. I'm gonna make sure we see those. Looks like a couple of them might be a little bit more specific to use cases. So that might be something, is that something that folks can reach out to you with more specific questions as well?
Johannes?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, I was just looking at some of the questions, and some of them probably will require a little bit more details around the use case to be able to give a good answer. I see something about MSAD domains and stuff like that. That probably will require a little bit more, info. And yeah, folks can reach out to us, obviously, on this.
Excellent. I'll go ahead and share some ways to get in touch with me as well. And if people would like, I can also pass people along to you and to the team and sort of get some specific answers on use cases there as well. All right, is there anything else from folks before we wrap up? All right, excellent. Well, do feel free to reach out if you have further questions. As I mentioned earlier, we're recording it, so we'll have a replay, and the replay and slides will be available in about 24 hours in the link that I posted there. And we look forward to having you back for future Day 1 and Beyond sessions and future Cloud Customer Connect sessions as well. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time. Have a great rest of your day.